The pro-life thought experiment asks, if a slave owner wants to own slaves, can we stop them? Showing that bodily autonomy cannot be absolute. This thought experiment is also more predominantly used to suggest that we are justified in making moral judgments about situations we have not personally experienced. The claim is that if someone insisted on a right to own slaves on the grounds of my body, my property, my choice, we would reject that appeal to autonomy. Therefore, the argument goes, bodily autonomy cannot justify abortion. At first glance, this seems to challenge simplistic formulations of pro-choice reasoning. But when the analogy is examined with care, its structure turns out to undermine the pro-life conclusion rather than support it. Slavery is morally abhorrent because it forces one person to bear extreme, involuntary burdens for the benefit of another. The slave's body, labor, time, and life trajectory are commandeered to serve the interests of the slave owner. The harms are asymmetrical. One party suffers profound costs, while the other reaps the benefits and are only deprived of those benefits without a slave to preform them. When this structure is mapped onto pregnancy, the roles invert relative to the pro-life framing. The pregnant person is the one whose body is used, whose health and autonomy are at stake, and whose life is significantly burdened. The fetus, meanwhile, is the dependent party receiving the benefits of that bodily labor. In this structural comparison, the pregnant person aligns best with the slave, not the slave owner. If the slavery analogy is taken seriously, it actually highlights the moral problem with forcing someone to sustain another's life through involuntary bodily service. Again, the core idea is this. Even if the enslaved person has no meaningful choice in the matter, the moral landscape of slavery is shaped by a stark asymmetry between the burdens imposed on the slave and the benefits enjoyed by the slave owner. The slave is subjected to extreme harms, loss of autonomy, instrumentalization, physical risk, coerced labor, without any elected compensation or voluntary agreement. Meanwhile, the slave owner gains substantial advantages: labor, economic profit, social status, and convenience. If we compare the harms the slave would suffer if enslaved versus the harms the slave owner would suffer if not allowed to own slaves, the moral difference is obvious. The slave faces catastrophic violations of personhood. The slave owner merely loses an unjust privilege. This intuitive asymmetry is what makes the abolitionist judgment so straightforward. When this structure is placed side by side with pregnancy, the symmetry becomes interesting. In pregnancy, the pregnant person bears the overwhelming burdens, physical risk, bodily invasion, long-term health consequences, and the redirection of life plans, while the embryo is the beneficiary of the pregnant person's labor and biological resources. If one were to map the roles purely in terms of who bears the burdens and who receives the benefits, the pregnant person aligns with the slave, and the embryo aligns with the slave owner. The party carrying the weight is not the one who gains. The party who gains is not the one who pays the cost. This does not mean the analogy is perfect. There are morally weighty disanalogies between pregnancy and slavery, including the moral status of the fetus and the intentions of the pregnant person. But the analogy fails in the very place it was meant to succeed. It does not show that bodily autonomy is irrelevant. It shows that forced use of a person's body is precisely the kind of violation that autonomy rights are designed to prevent. The fact that a slave could theoretically rebel or resist does not make slavery permissible, and similarly, the mere possibility of resistance does not justify institutions that impose involuntary bodily labor. The core wrongness lies in the forced use of a person's body at the expense of exceptional harms. Why is it used? The slavery comparison ends up revealing a deeper tension. It is often used within certain religious or pro-life frameworks as if it decisively supports the claim that one can morally judge abortion without having experienced pregnancy. Yet the analogy actually exposes the fragility of that move. Because some religious traditions historically permitted or regulated forms of servitude, appealing to slavery as a case of obvious moral clarity already rests on shaky ground. The argument tries to turn this internal vulnerability into an external strength by treating slavery as a universally condemned wrong that outsiders can judge without first-hand experience. The pregnant individual bears the overwhelming burdens, while the embryo receives the benefits, meaning the analogy, if taken seriously, actually supports the pro-choice intuition that forcing someone to undergo significant bodily burdens for another's sake is morally repugnant. Thus, the attempt to use slavery as a rhetorical tool to defend outsider moral judgment ends up undermining the very point it was meant to reinforce, turning what was intended as a strength into a demonstration of the argument's internal weakness. What the analogy does reveal is that pro-choice arguments should not rely on the claim that bodily autonomy is absolute. No right is absolute, and framing it that way invites easy counterexamples. A more robust view is called for one which has principles that avoids the pitfalls of absolutism while preserving the central moral insight. Forced pregnancy is a form of compelled bodily service that no other area of law or ethics appear to permit.